As a women's health professional, you already know how important menstrual cycle tracking is. But are you equipped to support your clients with complex cases? Do you know how to read complex menstrual cycle charts? Were you ever taught step-by-step protocols to deal with irregular bleeding patterns, abnormal cervical mucus, chaotic basal body temperatures, or progesterone issues? That's where FAMM comes in. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program is designed specifically for women's health professionals with busy practices. We've cut out all the fluff so we can be laser focused on what you need to serve your clients better. Registration is open now for the next class of FAMM. Classes start towards the end of October. Apply today at fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 538. In today's episode, we are going to talk all about when is the best time to have sex when you're trying to conceive. When it comes to fertility awareness-based methods, I often say that we really should be paying attention to mucus as the primary sign of fertility when we're trying to conceive, and the other signs that we may be tracking, whether it be basal body temperature or even an ovulation prediction device, those should come secondary to mucus. So in today's episode, we are diving into a study that looks at mucus specifically and its validity in identifying the fertile window, and also its impact on pregnancy rates and time to pregnancy. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So the title of today's research article, Stratification of Fertility Potential According to Cervical Mucus Symptoms. So as the title indicates, it really zones in on cervical mucus specifically. And they actually are looking specifically at the Billings ovulation method, which is one of the mucus-only methods of fertility awareness charting. And they're looking at how identifying that fertile window with the mucus sign only, what effect that has on fertility and pregnancy. So it's a really, really interesting study. So a little bit of background information in the study. They had a sample size of 384 participants who were desiring to achieve pregnancy. So in this sample, these participants were specifically trying to conceive, some of whom had been trying to conceive for some time and others potentially just starting out trying. And they had them keep a daily record of their cervical mucus observations through the lens of the Billings method. So the Billings method uses a combination of what they call vulvar sensation and as well as a visible observation. So a little bit different to the method that we teach our FAMM practitioners, but ultimately it is very similar in the most general sense because it is identifying those days of fertility specifically based on the mucus sign only. So for those of you who have listened to the podcast for a while, or for those of you who are familiar with fertility awareness-based methods, you'll know how essential, or at least somewhat, how essential cervical mucus is to identifying the window, what a crucial role it plays, especially for women who are trying to conceive. And there's a number of different reasons for them. One of the reasons is strictly timing. When we can identify the days of fertility based on cervical fluid, and, versus the days where we're not seeing any cervical fluid observations, that is telling us that our cervix is open. When we learn a little bit about the biology of our cervix, our reproductive tract, and the scientific knowledge behind the actual method of fertility awareness-based charting, then we learn that the cervix is actually closed most of the time throughout the menstrual cycle. It is plugged with a thick mucus plug outside of our fertile window that does not permit sperm or bacteria or any other kind of invaders to get anywhere near our reproductive tract. So anywhere near our fallopian tubes or the ovaries. And so when we can identify those days of cervical fluid leading up to ovulation, that is telling us that the cervix is actually open. So in terms of timing, that is one of the most crucial pieces of it. In addition to timing, cervical mucus also creates a wonderful environment for sperm. I'll often say that it's like a home away from home. And if you compare, say, the pH level and kind of overall environment of our cervical fluid, it is very complementary to a man's seminal fluid. So quite literally, home away from home, if you will. So that's a little bit of background. And it's interesting because once you start charting your cycles, this information can feel just so easy, so simple, because it's, after you learn it, it just does feel so intuitive. And it's kind of like, how did I know this? And when you start paying attention to your cervical fluid throughout the menstrual cycle, and you start to notice this pattern where as you approach ovulation, you actually see this fluid, you feel potentially like wet down there. You'll notice that it's, when you're wiping, it's really slippery. You'll notice maybe some discharge on your underwear. And now that you know what it is, it's like, oh my gosh, of course that's what it is. But when you didn't know, so for those of you who, learned fertility awareness, but there was a time when you didn't know, you can look back and you had no idea. Like I can look back from when I was a teenager and I had no idea that it was linked to fertility, to ovulation, to my menstrual cycle. I just knew that there were some days when I was wet and there was other days that I wasn't, and I had no idea why. And I just knew that I kind of felt irritated on those days because I was like, what's going on here? But until you get that knowledge and until that information is unlocked for you and you can actually understand it, most women really have no idea what that is. And we're going to talk more about that, about the just general lack of awareness of these signs, even though they are very straightforward after you learn them. So a few more details about the fertile window itself. When we look at what the research has to say about the fertile window is typically defined as a 6-day period of time. The 5 days leading up to ovulation plus ovulation day itself. And there's numerous studies that show that pregnancy results from, unprotected sexual intercourse during that 6-day period. And outside of that 6-day period, pregnancy doesn't really happen because that is truly the fertile window. So when we're able to pay attention to that cervical mucus sign and we're able to identify those days of mucus leading up to ovulation, we are really able to zone in on that 6-day window where, it actually counts. And as simple as it sounds, that is kind of like the key and the crux. So this is what they were looking at in the study. And so they took a group of couples who had been trying to conceive without this knowledge and then taught them how to identify their mucus sign, how to identify this window, and kind of saw what happened. I'll also mention that when you're tracking cervical fluid, each method might describe the different types of mucus with different words or in a slightly different way. But generally speaking, what women will observe is sometimes you'll observe like a lotiony type discharge. So the best way to describe it is like white creamy hand lotion. And at other times, women will observe that clear, kind of like raw egg white, stretchy cervical fluid. And if you were to pick it up and stretch it, it will typically form a thread between your fingers. And then at other times, it might be too watery to actually pick up, but you would wipe and feel a really lubricative sensation. So in the method of charting that I teach, we distinguish between those two main types of mucus. The clear, stretchy, lubricative type mucus, we call that peak mucus, and then the lotiony mucus we call non-peak mucus. So in all fertility awareness-based methods that teach mucus, they typically teach women how to identify between these types of mucus. And although pregnancy is possible on any day of cervical fluid leading up to ovulation, regardless of what type, when we're looking to optimize chances of conception, we do want to prioritize the days where you have that clear, stretchy cervical fluid. And in particular, the days that you have it in the highest quantities. That's not because pregnancy can't happen on the other days. And it's not because the other days are not fertile or less fertile, because you can't be more or less pregnant. So I'm very careful how I word these things. It's not to say that you are less fertile. But on those days where you have the clear and stretchy type of cervical fluid in the greatest quantities, that is typically associated with the highest levels of estrogen, which puts us as closer to ovulation. So again, going into that timing conversation, when we can identify those days of quote peak fertility, that can be really helpful in terms of getting that timing closer to ovulation, which can increase the overall chance of pregnancy per cycle. Now, before I get into the results from the study, because they're really interesting, I think as I was going through them, I was getting kind of excited to share this with all of you. But I think one thing that's really interesting about it, just to kind of put it back into perspective, there's a study on fertility awareness knowledge among women seeking fertility assistance. And this study was done by Dr. Carrie Hampton. I had her on the podcast many years ago. And in that study, she found that only about 12.7% of women could accurately identify their fertile window. So they had, a group of women, and they felt quite confident in their ability to identify their fertile window. But when it was actually put to the test, very few of them were actually doing it right. So for those of you who've been longtime listeners, or those of you who've been charting your menstrual cycle for a long time, it can seem like this easy thing that everyone should know, but we represent a very small percentage of the population, those who are actually kind of aware and practicing fertility awareness-based methods. And also for the women's health practitioners who are listening. So if you are a women's health practitioner, not only do your clients not have this information, but most practitioners don't have this information either, regardless of the profession. So whether we're talking about medical doctors, naturopathic doctors, nutritionists, even women's health coaches, in a general sense, most women's health practitioners don't necessarily have this knowledge either. And that's because it's not really a standard part of most trainings whatsoever. It's just not a thing. And we've had many practitioners go through our FAMM program. And ultimately, if there was any training related to fertility awareness, which is really just not common, so the vast majority had none. But if there was any trainings that they did after they received their, certification that had like a unit on fertility awareness, typically those units were very short, brief, and not really detailed. So we're looking at a pretty significant issue where the majority of women are just not being given this information. And so then this leads us back to the study. So what happens when we are given this information? Attention women's health professionals, the next round of FAMM is just around the corner. Classes are starting toward the end of October. FAMM is the perfect program for busy women's health professionals who want to offer fertility awareness charting support in their practice. FAMM cuts out all the fluff and only focuses on what you need to serve your clients better. Each module, homework assignment, in-class training, and chart review session is there for a reason. Where will you be 9 months from now? With a FAMM certification, you'll have a brand new skill set that will allow you to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool and vital sign in your practice. Your confidence in analyzing and interpreting menstrual cycle charts will be at a level you can't even imagine today. And you'll have a brand new offering in your business that will allow you to reach more clients. This knowledge is truly life-changing. Transform your practice in 9 months. You won't regret it. Join us this year in FAMM. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive to apply today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. So I'll read this piece from the study because I feel like this also helps us to kind of get into the results. What the researchers said is the major finding from this data is that the identification of fertile and infertile mucus patterns is a powerful predictor of successful conception. The researchers found a statistically significant benefit. So once these couples were taught how to identify their fertile days based on cervical mucus, the pregnancy rates as well as time to conception improved significantly. They found that once they taught the couples how to identify their fertile days based on mucus, that knowledge and the change in behavior that resulted was associated with an approximately 30% increase in pregnancy rates in the study. And they did note that the quality of mucus was related to the time to pregnancy and also the overall chance of pregnancy. So they noted that women with optimal mucus patterns tended to conceive more rapidly, and there was a higher percentage of women with more optimal cervical fluid observations who conceived within the time frame of the study. So if you want the data, I know some of you probably want the data, women who had those peak mucus symptoms or higher rates of it. So women with more optimal mucus on average conceived within about 4.2 months versus the women whose mucus observations were a bit less optimal. And they took a bit of a longer time on average to conception, about 6 months. So a pretty significant difference based on the quality of mucus alone being the main differentiator. Another interesting stat was that the majority of the women who conceived in the study, so about 77% of the women who conceived within the first 6 months, and 92% conceived within the first 12 months. So the majority of pregnancies took place within the first 6 months. So what do we do with this information, right? What are the main takeaways? What does it mean? I think in some respects, it's fairly straightforward. I think that when we zoom the lens out and look at what we can take from the study from a practical standpoint, whether you yourself tuned into this episode because you're trying to conceive and you're wanting to make sure that you are timing sex correctly, or whether you're a women's health practitioner and you're wanting to support your clients to more effectively time sex for pregnancy and also to feel more confident with their charting strategies. I think the biggest takeaway is that, as simple as it sounds to those of us who've been charting our cycles for a long time or for a short time, it is the key to understanding. And so one of the things that I always talk about with our FAMM practitioners is to support our clients to get out of that rhythm method thinking. I can talk about mucus until I'm blue in the face, but your average woman, even who charts her cycles or kind of understands, is still often thinking in terms of her, like in terms of the date. So many women, so many of my clients, even our practitioners at the beginning of the program, are thinking in terms of their date of ovulation. I usually ovulate on day 14. I usually ovulate on day 15 or whatever. And so they're often making decisions and making judgments, sometimes subconsciously. It's not like they mean to do it, but they're often thinking in terms of that date and planning accordingly. They're not always thinking primarily of mucus. And I can give many examples. One example is if you happen to start observing mucus earlier in your cycle, so you start to see mucus right after your period is done. I think there are many women who are, again, in that rhythm method thinking that will be more likely to kind of ignore what they're seeing and think to themselves, oh, it's too early. And so even if they're trying to conceive, they might not have sex on those days that are optimal for conception because those are the days of mucus based on this idea that, oh, it's too early. And on the flip side, if you're expecting to ovulate around day 14, and maybe you even do see a little bit of mucus along the way, you might just assume that you did ovulate and then just stop tracking. Your mucus could come back a few days later because you didn't ovulate in this example. And then you ovulate later on, but you could completely miss it just because you're not looking for it. You have it in your mind that you already ovulated or that I never ovulate this late or whatever it is. And then you just kind of go about your merry way and miss an opportunity. So this is one of the reasons why studies like this one show an improvement in pregnancy rates, because when you teach a couple how to identify that fertile window and you tell them that those days of mucus are the days that they should be having sex on when they're trying to conceive, it makes a huge difference. And for many couples, that one change is enough to kind of get things rolling and obviously for conception to happen. Now, on the flip side, there are couples who do know this information and who are tracking. So you might be listening to this episode and you have been tracking. Maybe you have been tracking your cycle. Maybe you know the days of fertility. Maybe you have been timing sex along with your mucus and pregnancy hasn't been happening. So on the flip side, I think that if we start when we're looking to support, and the researchers get to this, I'll read a little piece of what they said about this, but the researchers got to this point as well. If you have couples who then we teach them how to identify those optimal days of fertility and they're timing sex correctly, then that typical advice of wait a year before you get a fertility assessment, I feel like that doesn't exactly apply, because when you have a couple who's specifically timing sex correctly and not just like in their head correctly, we can look at the chart, we can see that they're timing sex on those days of mucus leading up to ovulation. We can see on their chart ovulation confirmed through the temperature shift and the mucus drying up. So we know that they're timing sex correctly. We know that like the sex is being tracked on the chart, so we know that it's happening at the correct time. So, there are a number of studies that I've read that then suggest that if we are timing sex correctly, and they usually refer to that as fertility-focused intercourse, meaning that you're timing it correctly, then we could truncate that usual suggestion of a year to 6 months. Because if pregnancy isn't happening within that first 6 months, then we may need to be looking at other things. And of course, in Real Food for Fertility, Lily and I talk extensively about some of the other things that we need to be looking at. So timing is essential, because if timing is not correct, you can't get pregnant. So timing is essential, but it's not everything. So we need to get the timing right, but that doesn't mean that timing it correctly is just going to solve all the problems. And of course, one of the things that I always bring up is sperm quality. We always need to be looking at that, because it's something that, I even had a conversation today with one of our practitioners, and, the client, it was one of those conversations I've had this many times where it's like, oh, well, he already had children, so we know he's fertile. And I was like, well, how old are the children? And she's like, oh, well, I think they're in their teens. Like, that was a long time ago. We need to investigate men just the same way that we would investigate women when we have concerns about fertility challenges. So one of the conclusions that the researchers made about this, kind of along the same lines, was how helpful this approach can be overall, because it provides a targeted and specific, tailored approach based on what's happening with the couple. As a first port of call, before we jump to, tens of thousands of dollars for fertility treatments, it is useful to chart. And from my perspective, when we get into the conversation about using the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, in addition to timing, we also want to track a woman's fertile signs to determine if her cycle is normal, if she's falling into normal parameters, if her mucus patterns are normal, and if they're not normal, because in the study, they did show that women who had mucus patterns that were not optimal did tend toward a longer time to conception. So they did show this link between optimal cervical mucus and a shorter time to pregnancy and higher pregnancy rates overall. Mucus, again, is the same kind of concept. Mucus is not everything, but it's really important because it does play a crucial role in supporting sperm survival and transport and all of these amazing features. So if we're able to chart the cycle and identify if her parameters are normal, so parameters including overall cycle length, mucus quality and quantity to see if the mucus pattern is normal. We can look at her period to see if that's falling into normal parameters. We can look at when ovulation is taking place in the cycle. So if it's happening between days 10 and 22 approximately is what we need in order for that cycle to fall within that normal range, somewhere between 24 to 35 days. And we also want to look at the post-ovulatory phase. So that period of time between ovulation and her next period to see if it's long enough or if there's signs potentially of low progesterone or other hormone imbalances. So there's a lot of information that we can glean from the cycle. And then also, if you have a client whose cycle is pretty good and it is falling into normal parameters, but pregnancy isn't happening, that's also a good flag for us to look at him and ensure that he's being assessed and his sperm quality is being looked at to see if there could be any other issues. So lots of great takeaways from this research study. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you can think of a friend or someone who would benefit from hearing this episode, then the share link is fertilityfriday.com/538. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I would love it if you would leave a review and rating on Apple Podcasts. That really helps new listeners to learn about what the show's about and, of course, helps people to find the episode. I read all of the reviews and it really helps to get the word out about the show. If you've been enjoying the FAMM research series, you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/research and you'll see the entire list of all of our research episodes. If you're wanting to dive into the study that I was looking at today, you can also find that information listed on our show notes page, which you'll also find over at fertilityfriday.com/538. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving the FAMM research series or our FAMM practitioner series, then I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. It's a 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness to your clients, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Our next class starts on October 22nd, so there's still time for you to reserve your spot. There's no other program like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive to apply now. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE.